we can just address the fact that NIL as a term is not the same as name, image, and likeness. And then you get into the fact that there's collectives and there are what the school does. And so I'm trying to learn more. I am. It's a complicated thing to get to the bottom of. And so what better way to do so than by bringing someone on who actually works in this world, specifically from the school side. Haneen Rashwan is the Assistant Director of NIL at Oklahoma State, and she joins us today on the 1012. Haneen, sorry, welcome.
Thank you. Excited to be on.
I'm
crazy.
I'm thrilled to. This is a busy time of year for you guys, right? I mean, you got players going into and out of the portal. You're trying to help figure out stuff. The thing that I have to start with is this,
Mhm.
I'm going to go with questions out of order. Like, obviously, the viewpoint from fans so much of is that NIL is driving so much of the transfer portal, right? We're watching players enter and leave and go to this school and choose that school, and it's all, the theory is it's all money driven, right? Which is not accurate. We've talked about this with other guests. Like, it's not all about money. That doesn't mean that isn't for some the majority of the reason, and for some a portion of the reason.
Yeah.
But when it comes to the schools, because there are rules about what the schools are and aren't supposed to do, whether they all follow them and whether or not those rules are enforced. So I am curious, what does role does the school play? Does the NIL department at a university, at the athletic department, actually play when it comes to working with the players, the students, in regards to NIL?
Yeah, so the institutions play a huge part into the overall picture. I think you hit it on the head. People tend to think that these student athletes enter the portal because of money reasons, and that's actually far from the truth. The majority of the people that enter the portal, probably the last thing on their mind is money. The first thing is playing time, most likely. From the institution, there's so much of a responsibility because, like you said, there's so much inaccurate information, and from our side, we have to educate these kids, you know, especially when you enter kind of into this NIL world because there's no, like you said, there's restrictions, but they're not really enforced, right? And there's so many different pieces. It's a lot for a student athlete to understand. So somebody has to be a resource for them. So from the institution, you see that we'll do a lot of educational programming. But from my side, especially in here at Oklahoma State, my goal is really to prepare these kids for the next step, right? So I'm not just looking at these 4 years that they're going to spend at Oklahoma State or in this college setting, but for the people that are going to go pro afterwards, or for the people that are going to go into the workforce, what are the lessons that we can teach them through NIL that they're going to take on afterwards? So as an institution, what you'll see is I'll do a lot of brand building, personal branding, content workshops, just basic kind of taxes, contracts, different things that apply into the NIL world that these student athletes need, not just now, but they're going to need in the future, right? So as an institution, you have to have that programming in place. You have to have it. It's crucial because there's so much inaccurate information. You need to educate your student athletes on, if somebody tells you this, that's against the rules. That's a violation. They shouldn't be telling you this, which in the area of the portal is unfortunate. But there's so many different pieces that these student athletes need to be prepared for and educated. And as an institution, it's our responsibility to do that. And that's why you see all these NIL departments and programs, because you have to have that piece. These kids have to be educated. And you have to create programming in a department and has to build this out. There's no guide, there's no textbook on how to do this. You really have to sit there and think of, this is what needs to happen, this is what we need to do because of certain circumstances and how we want to prepare these kids. Because unfortunately, there's not really a guide on how to do it. So you kind of have to make it as you go, but it's extremely crucial. Obviously there's restrictions on what the institution can and can't do. To a certain extent, the institution has, obviously the biggest thing really is that we're not negotiating, but everything else is fair game. As long as we're not negotiating something on behalf of a student athlete, that's really the restriction on the institution. But we can really work to, once again, educate, promote these student athletes, promote our collectives. So there are multiple things that the institution can do as long as they're not crossing the line and negotiating.
So you mentioned a lot, and I want to try and touch on everything there. One of them being, obviously when NIL got put into place, you
Mhm.
just said it, there was no guidebook on how to do this. Like, we understand what name, image, and likeness is as a term. It is the ability to profit off of your name, image, and likeness. But what that meant in college athletics was so undefined. Everyone's had to figure this out along the way. What
Yeah.
are some of the biggest things you feel like you guys have learned internally over these last few years of just trying to like figuring things? Oh, look at this. We didn't expect this. Oh, like what have been some of the biggest surprises or things that you feel like you guys have learned there at OSU?
Yeah. So luckily for me, I started this thing being in this space back in like September of 21. So I've really been able to see the evolution of kind of what this space really is. Um, I think the biggest kind of surprise for me was when NIL first was legalized, you know, you really thought it was going to be actual NIL, right? So what you really thought was it was really just going to be the student athletes being able to profit off their name, image, and likeness. So if somebody were to come sell a jersey of a student athlete, they'd be able to get compensated for that. If somebody were going to sell XYZ of a student athlete, they'd be able to get money, or if they were going to do an event, they could pay them, which I think should have always been a thing, right? But then what you started to see was kind of the conversation shift into then collectives became a thing, which for me looking back, I would have never expected. Now it kind of makes a little bit more sense. But then you start to see the collective starting to form, and then you start to see the space kind of get away from what I like to call real NIL, right? You start to see it shift. You start to see the conversations of now these student athletes becoming employees, and all these different proposals and policies start to shift. And you see the landscape shift of, at the beginning when I first started, these kids were doing what we call true NIL, like businesses being activated, them doing events, merchandise, cool, the jerseys. That's what you really saw in the beginning. And then you started to see less and less, and it turned into kind of the collective space. And now what you're starting to see is, because of everything going on, you've lost the businesses. So that was a shock, because it was like it did a flip, and now, the businesses are weary of working with student athletes. So because of everything going on in the media, and obviously it's an ever evolving landscape. So that was kind of a shock. But then as it keeps growing, obviously there's a lot of different things in play. Like if you ever would have told me 2 years ago the federal government would be involved in this, I kind of would have looked at you funny, because it's like, how in what capacity, but that's how much the space really is changing, and it will continue to change. So the biggest shocks for me is just seeing the evolution that's kind of happened, but then also it's seeing how much NIL kind of gets demonized, right? Obviously, I love the space. I work in it every day, and I've seen the positives of it. I've really seen how this space has changed the lives of certain student athletes. I think there's a huge kind of misconception on what this space really is and what it does. And obviously, it goes back to the amount of inaccurate information, which is so unfortunate. Um, that really drives kind of the whole feeling on what this space and world looks like. And it's so unfortunate because it's such a positive thing that gets so much negativity around it. And I don't think we spend enough time really touching on the positives. So those are a few things that I feel like kind of internally you kind of have never expected or saw coming, but it's
I mean,
here.
the negativity is understandable. I mean, we're dealing with this in everything in
Yeah.
a phase of life. When there is not information, people are going to fill in that hole with
Yeah.
assumptions. And the assumptions on things, because of a complete lack of transparency on how much kids are actually getting in NIL from collections and how much of it's being used in inducement and how the space works. General fans don't know. There are plenty. This is why I'm having this interview. I don't pretend to say that I understand it. And I think there are plenty of people in the media as well who don't really truly understand everything. I think they know some information more than like
Yeah.
most of us do, but you got to fill in the gap somehow, because we just
Exactly.
want to understand what the role is in
Hmm.
recruiting, in the transfer portal, in
Yeah.
college athletics, what its role is, and we don't, because there is a lack of transparency and understanding, and in many ways intentionally, in other ways because I think, as you have said, you're all still figuring this out. And so to give out some
Yeah.
piece of information about what NILs could be completely moot and not true within a couple of months.
Yeah, I mean, it's ever evolving, and back there is a lack of transparency, but there's a lack of transparency because to a certain extent, um, we can't disclose some of what's happening. From an institution standpoint, I can't disclose anything about our student athletes because it's a privacy thing. It's between them, the business, and between them and whoever. I might know about it, and obviously I have to know about it for compliance reasons and things. But for me to sit out here and say like, oh yeah, no, this is, I can't, because it's not my place to say things, nor is it really, kind of to a certain extent, some of these other businesses and collectives, you won't hear them say anything either, because some of them, it's also, once again, it's the student athletes NIL, right? And that's the issue of why you have that lack of transparency. And it's hard because, like you said, people just end up making assumptions about what's actually going on, and for the most part, it's far from the truth. I mean, I just saw the interview that Matt Rule did, that a quarterback out of the portal will cost you 2 million, and that is far from the truth. Which is, that's a overly exaggerated number. It's actually kind of funny because the majority of your collectives, that's the budget that they're running out of, is that 2-3 million. So for them to spend that much on a quarterback, it's not true. Which is crazy because from my world, and I'm very connected, I know kind of where everybody's sitting at, and kind of where everybody is, but a quarterback out of the portal is not going to cost you that much. And I think the other piece too, and when you do see numbers, which is the problem, you don't know where those numbers are being come up with, because the problem is that you have in this space is, let's say, for example, I'll use Utah. So if Utah, which keep in mind, all of this shouldn't even be, depending on the rules and how you look at them, a lot of this is violations that are just blatantly being said, right? So technically NIL is not supposed to be used in recruiting, that's a violation. Does it? Yes, but it's not supposed to be. But let's say, for example, so Utah had the deal in which they gave all of their scholarship players a $60,000 truck, right? So if Utah were to use NIL in recruiting, what they'll come say is, oh, we'll give you an NIL package of, let's say, $100,000. You as a student athlete, you're like, oh, $100,000? Yeah, I'm going there. Cool. What you don't sometimes realize, they're factoring in that $60,000 truck. So in reality, you're only getting like $40,000 maybe liquid in cash and a $60,000 truck, but they told you 100,000. So you believed you were getting 100,000, but that's not really the case. So what you're going to see is some of these numbers aren't really actual like cash that these kids are walking away with. I think I saw something that like Marvin Harrison Jr. what is allegedly has 20 to 25 million in NIL to return to Ohio State, and I'm just like, that's far from the truth. Far. And the issue is, I don't think a lot of people realize collectives aren't operating out of millions dollars of budgets. So to pay these high $1 million amounts for one player on one team, it's not feasible. And we have to understand, and obviously it's hard because of the lack of transparency. Some of the numbers you're hearing are far from the truth, and they'll never be a reality because at the same time, we understand the space, but this is NIL at the collegiate level. A wide receiver being offered 25 million, what's the incentive to then go pro? We have to keep that level of, these kids still have to move on to the next phase. We can't match the pros. We can't get up to that level. And it's unfortunate, but there's so much inaccurate information, and a lot of it comes down to the numbers. But like you said, it's people putting assumptions, but I don't think a lot of people realize how these numbers are come up with. But then on the flip side of, there's a second part of NIL, like, and I think we talked about this a little bit, of directives versus collective, and people don't realize there's two types of NIL.
So what is the relationship between the university's NIL department and the collective? Because collective is what we all think of when it comes to NIL,
Yeah.
right? And we've tied these because they're tied to universities, and most of them
Right.
have one big one. Everyone started with like 3, 4, 5, and they've merged into one. Oklahoma State had a couple different ones that are now mostly just
Yeah.
Pokes with a Purpose. So, I mean, using Pokes with a Purpose as an example, what is the relationship like for the universities and collectives, and what's the relationship like with Oklahoma State and Pokes with a Purpose?
Yeah, so there obviously has to be a relationship there because we have to educate them because they're not a part of the institution. They don't know what the rules are. They don't know what recruiting rules are. They don't know what the NIL policy is. They don't know any of this. They're volunteers. And that's the majority of these collectives, they just want to help out their institutions, but we're liable for everything they do. So it's very crucial that you know what they're doing and you know the conversations that they're having and that you're educating them on, hey, you can't be talking to a kid about this. You guys can't be involved in recruiting this way. You can't do this. We have to be there for them to answer their questions and educate them. So we meet with our collective once every 2 weeks to see what's going on, if there's anything from our side. So our collective is a Learfield sponsor. So what are the activations that they're doing? How can we amplify them from an institution? So what you'll start to see from us is on our Jumbotron during football games, you saw Posts with a Purpose, like advertisements to get people to donate. What you'll see is we really push out, like if they just launched a membership program, we'll kind of amplify the things that they're doing because we understand the collective is a fundraising arm. This is the fundraising piece of NIL. It's not all of NIL, but it's the fundraising piece of it. So it's very important that we help them as much as we can and within the rules, but really serve as a resource for them to make sure that they understand what they can and can't do, and then also help them in, okay, how can we get the word out more? How can we really put this out there? So it's very crucial to have that relationship with them. And we're lucky. All of our people at our collective are amazing. We love working with them. They're all amazing. They've been amazing people for us. So we don't deal with a lot of problems with them, but to say the least, that's not everybody's situation.
So I'll ask this as I'm just going to ask, how does Oklahoma State's handling of NIL differ in your mind from other universities?
Yeah, so I think it goes back to kind of what our philosophy has been from day one is we wanted to do NIL our way and we wanted to do it the OSU way, which is what you'll see is, like I said, going back to we want to prepare these student athletes not just for this phase, but for the next and after, they're done playing collegiately. What does that look like? Which you'll see how it differs in our approach. We do a lot more programming and workshops than probably a lot of other schools do. I probably have a workshop every 2-3 weeks on certain different topics because I really want these kids to be prepared. So we're a lot more hands-on than a lot of other institutions are in the space because of that. And it's really important that from my perspective that a student athlete walks out of here knowing how to do something that they previously haven't done, whether it's being able to know what to look for in a contract, on their own, being able to, market themselves, how to reach out to brands, how to reach out to a company, being able to do their own taxes, because that's another thing now that a lot of these student athletes have to learn how to do early. Mom and dad can't do your taxes anymore. There's so many different things that we have to prepare these student athletes for. And I think we've been lucky enough from day one. We've said that our stance, we wanted to do this the right way. So we obviously follow the rules very closely, but we wanted to prepare these student athletes to where, from my perspective, they wouldn't need to hire somebody. If they even go pro, you won't need somebody to keep sitting there looking at every single contract you get, because the words you're supposed to look for, what you're not supposed to sign, this is what you're wanting, what your value is, kind of what the deliverables are going to be, and how to look for that stuff. So that's why we prepare them. But then also, there's certain things that obviously are going to change, but then there's certain lessons that can be learned. You're controlling your own business. Your brand is your business. So teaching them over the 4 years how to run that brand can really help them in the long term. And if, we've had so many student athletes graduate from here who now have a career that they would have never imagined because of what they did in the NIL space, and we're able to build off of that when they graduated. So it's really how we differ from a lot of different institutions, is really we focus on that educational programming a lot more than a lot of other institutions.
So I I meant to lead off with this, but I'll get to it now. What is your role? I know that Director of NIL Barry Henson calls you his mouse in his pocket. But what is your role there at Oklahoma State specifically on a day-to-day basis? What is it you're doing? You mentioned, doing the educational programs. What else goes into what you have to do?
Yeah. So obviously educating the student athletes is a big thing and being a resource there for them for the things that they need. But then I also have to educate the public and the local businesses on what they can and can't do and get them to activate in this space. So in a multitude of ways that can happen, whether it's social media or working on flyers and community guides to help activate them, working on events. We just had a summit with Learfield and they brought in their sponsors. And we just kind of educated them on NIL. So that's a big piece of what I do. And then obviously the programming and the workshops, setting that up. Right now, I'm planning spring programming, what that looks like. Because in the era of the portal, you obviously are continuously bringing in student athletes. They have to, understand what the rules are here and how we do it because it differs from the institutions they're coming from, the high school kids that are moving into this level. So I have to work on that, but then also making sure in this era that, student athletes are meeting their requirements, meaning if they sign a contract, making sure that they're at that date and time and place that they're supposed to be. So it's monitoring, making sure what's going on so I can make sure that everything's happening and nobody's upset if a student athlete doesn't show up or if something happens, making sure that I'm there. So a lot of my day looks like just making sure everything's being coordinated correctly. The student athlete knows where they're supposed to be, what time, the dates, the details, making sure that's all on par, and then planning kind of the programming, and then making sure at the same time working with the local businesses, planning out these events. And then as things, as things start to happen kind of in the NCAA world and the federal world and state world, making sure I'm staying educated. And if there's something we need to change or if there's something we need to adjust, making sure that I'm there as a resource and that we're ahead of that. So like when the NCAA proposal came out, obviously was a lot of our student athletes were texting me like, hey, what does this mean for us? Like, what is this? So keeping up with the trends that are going on so I know how to better assist our student athletes is a really big thing as well.
Yeah, you mentioned all the national stuff. Charlie Baker put out their proposal about a
Mhm.
D1 plus. One of the things that he also proposed was for any Division I school to be able to opt into school athletic departments doing direct NIL deals with their players. Now that specifically would be as, let's say, the example that was given was kind of like, hey, now you could put a player's face on a basketball ticket and they can make a profit off of that. So the school starts doing deals with the students. And
Yeah.
obviously, you guys are working constantly to stay up to date on the rules and adapt to new things that are coming out. What are your thoughts on that rule implementation of the school actually being able to pay the players there? And is that something
Mhm.
that OSU, if made legal, would look at doing as well?
Yeah. So kind of longevity wise, I think at some point, the institutions need to have more of a hands-on approach to all of this. Um, and this isn't taking away from anything, but it's hard, you know, from our standpoint, where our hands are tied from a lot of things that we probably should be involved with. I get texts all the time about different things that I'm like, whether it's a collective or outside entity, and I'm just like, it would help if we were able to, have that power. Um, and I actually been in-housed, it makes it so much easier, so much easier. Um, So I think eventually we're gonna get to that. I would hope we get to that like space and that, there's a proposal that everybody's okay with. And I think all of us are really okay with the institutions want this. I think there's not any NIL director that I've talked to who says, no, we don't want this in-housed. Everybody wants that because we work in it every day and we know that it would make everybody's lives so much easier if we were given more power. Um, Whether or not that's gonna happen, I mean, we all saw the proposal. There's multiple different things that have to happen for that to go through. So we'll see kind of what happens. It's so hard to, predict what's going to happen in this space. Like I said, when I started in 21, I would have never thought collectives would have been a thing. And then not even a few months later is when they started to form. And I was just like, huh? And then, like I said, we never knew the extent to how this thing was going to grow. You ended up getting state laws that were formed. The federal government got involved, and all these other things. So it's very hard to where this space is going to go. But I think definitely what you're going to see in the future is the institutions probably being a lot more involved.
Which makes a lot of sense to have something as important as the collectives have become kept separate from the
Yeah.
university. So the universities have no real say or control outside of influence on those. Like it
Mhm.
does, and then the schools being at risk of being punished for what the collective does. Like
Exactly.
that's I mean, it's kind of like having a kid that you just gave a giant millions of dollars bankroll and a car, and they're in another state, and you're like, well, I can't, like, I'm doing my best to parent, like, but you're responsible for whatever happens to them, right?
Exactly. And
And
we're
so
lucky that we've got a great relationship with our collective, but I can tell you there are a bunch of institutions that don't, and there's some collectives that really don't even work with the institution at all, and keep them out, whether they've got, confidentiality or exclusive pieces to their contracts to where the institution can't know. There's a lot of those, or some other institutions that have more than one collective. There's a certain institution out there that has 5 collectives, and they're liable for every single one of them. You know, that's the unfortunate piece. And so I think eventually, we're going to get to that space in which the institutions are more involved, and like you said, they're not worried about outside entities um harming our student athletes, but then also harming the institution.
yeah, it definitely feels like it's something that needs to come. I understand why the separation originally existed, but at
Yeah,
this point, that separation is actually more, to me, more dangerous for the schools than keeping them separate from the collectives, and allowing
exactly.
the institutions to have more control over how some of this stuff is done is should be a benefit to both the universities and the student athletes that they are caring for.
Yeah, the term we like to use is it's very much shark infested waters, and it's unfortunate because the only people really who shouldn't be harmed that are being harmed are the student athletes. I have seen the worst contracts you could have ever seen. Things that would never fly ever with anybody, you know? And unfortunately, that's just kind of the space that we're in because you have too many outside sources. One of the biggest issues is anybody can be an agent in this space. And it's just like Joe Schmo down the road could be your agent. Does Joe know anything? No, but he's your agent. Like, there are certain things that just should not be allowed, and they would never be allowed in any other capacity, but we need to work towards solving that.
Like it's like anything new. There are always kinks and things. Never buy first generation anything. Wait till they work some of the bugs out and people have used them and tested them and hated them, and then by third, fourth generation we'll get there. And
Right.
look, this thing is ever changing. It is still in its infancy, and so
Exactly.
it's going to take a little time. But
Yeah.
obviously that role will continue to change. Haneen, you have been awesome and very insightful. I really
Yeah.
appreciate your time today. If there's one last thing you'd like fans to kind of take away from NIL, what would that be?
Don't believe everything you see, unfortunately. I would love to say otherwise, but the numbers that you're hearing are far from the truth. And this is as somebody who's very connected in this space and to a lot of other institutions, just not even Oklahoma State. I know pretty much everywhere, a lot of different NIL directors at other institutions. We're all actually very close. We all have a huge group chat. We have multiple group chats actually. So we talk about this stuff on the regular. And we find a lot of it so funny because it's like it's far from the truth. But what I want people to understand, NIL is not a bad thing. Um, at its core, it really is amazing, and I've seen NIL change the lives of student athletes. Some of them are able to help their families back home because of the extra income that they now have, and some are able to start their lives. They're able to propose, they're able to buy a house, they're able to put money to the side for other expenses, it really does change lives. And it really does help. So if there's one thing that I can tell you guys, it's really don't believe everything you see. And NIL is not a bad thing, you know. Like you said, it's just in its infancy space right now, and it's still at the beginning. We haven't even scratched the surface on where this thing can go. So there's obviously going to be some bumps and some hurdles that needs to be fixed and we need to kind of improve. But NIL at its core is really amazing. And we should do everything in our power to be able to support it and really support these student athletes because it really can make a huge, huge difference. And as this space keeps to evolve, those hurdles will go away. And then you will look back at it and laugh and be like, oh my God, that was so funny. Why was that ever a thing? You know, but that's kind of where it is. But it really is an amazing space. I love being in it, and everybody else who works in it, we love being in it, and we're in it for the right reasons because we truly do see the impact that this space has been able to have, whether it's monetarily and sometimes it's just educational wise. Being able to teach a kid how to do their taxes on their own, that's something that they're going to remember forever. There are lessons that these student athletes are now learning because of NIL that are bigger than what we really realize. I mean, it's because we don't talk about it, and it goes back to a lot of that lack of transparency. But there are things that these student athletes are really thriving and learning in this space. That's amazing. So really just don't believe everything you see out there. But hopefully in the next few years, you know, we'll be at a space where we're all going back laughing at some of this stuff.